Okay, folks, ready for a deep dive today? We are going way back to 1678
Oh, yeah.
to a place that we now know as Portland, Maine,
Okay.
for a look at the Treaty of Casco.
Treaty of Casco.
Um, Now, this treaty was a really fascinating attempt at peace between English colonists
Mm,
and the Wabanaki Confederacy,
right.
a powerful group of indigenous tribes in New England.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about this particular treaty is that it really comes on the heels
Oh, really?
of a really, really brutal conflict, King Philip's War.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that
Yeah,
because I know that the 1670s in New England were incredibly tense.
extremely tense, a lot of violence.
Yeah.
And, you know, the war officially ended in 1676.
Oh, okay.
But the underlying tension, the clash between, you know, this colonial expansion and indigenous rights,
Right.
that hadn't gone away at all.
So the Treaty of Casco itself wasn't really about ending the fighting.
Right.
It was almost like, okay, how do we coexist now?
Yeah, exactly. How do we move forward? Because the reality is that they had to figure out a way to live together.
Yeah.
And so this treaty was really all about trying to find some sort of compromise.
Right.
So what ended up happening was the indigenous leaders agreed to recognize English sovereignty
Okay.
in the coastal areas. So
Oh,
basically, they conceded essentially English rule and law
Wow.
in those regions.
What did they get in return?
That's a great question. So in exchange for that really significant concession,
Yeah.
they were promised protection from the English against threats from other tribes.
Okay.
And perhaps even more importantly, they retained the rights to their interior lands.
Okay.
So the lands that were further inland,
Right.
which was really crucial for them to be able to preserve, you know, their traditional ways of life.
That makes sense.
Their hunting grounds, their sacred sites.
Yeah.
All of that was really important, and it was tied to that interior land.
So it wasn't just about, territory, and I'm assuming that the treaty also covered things like trade.
Absolutely, because trade was essential
Yeah.
for both sides. I mean, the Wabanaki tribes, they relied on trade with the English to get things like metal tools,
Right.
woven cloth, and then, this is interesting, beaver pelts.
Beaver pelts.
Beaver pelts were hugely valuable
Okay.
to the English,
For what?
primarily for making hats.
For hats.
Yeah, so there was this huge demand for beaver pelts,
Okay.
and the treaty actually tried to address that by making sure that there were fair prices for those pelts,
Oh, interesting.
and that the Wabanaki had access to the goods that they needed in return.
So almost like trying to prevent exploitation.
Exactly, yeah, trying to make sure that it was a more equitable exchange.
Yeah. So besides, kind of the economics of it, did it also cover other aspects of their lives?
It did. It actually went a step further, and this is what I think is really fascinating about this treaty.
Okay.
The English also agreed to respect indigenous hunting, fishing, and farming practices, which might seem obvious to us now. But back then, that was actually pretty groundbreaking.
Yeah.
Because it was an acknowledgement that these activities weren't just, hobbies or something. They were absolutely central
Right.
to the Wabanaki way of life,
Right.
their culture, their survival. And so for the English to recognize that and say, okay, we will respect that. You
Yeah.
can continue these practices. That was a really significant step.
So they really were trying to find that balance.
Exactly. They were really trying to strike a balance and say, okay, we understand that you have a right to be here.
Yeah.
You have a right to maintain your traditions,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to try to coexist.
But my question is, did it work?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Correct.
And sadly, the answer is no.
Oh.
Not in the long term. You
Yeah.
see, the reality is that those pressures, those driving forces behind colonial expansion,
Okay.
that hunger for land and resources,
Right.
those never really went away.
Of course not.
And as those English settlements continued to grow and push further inland,
Yeah.
those tensions inevitably resurfaced.
Right. And so just a few years later, you have another major conflict, King William's War in the 1690s.
Oh, wow.
Which again, is another chapter in this long and often tragic story
Yeah.
of colonial expansion and its impact on indigenous people.
So it sounds like the Treaty of Casco was more of a pause
Mm-hmm.
than a true lasting peace.
Yeah, you could say that it was a moment of respite,
Yeah.
a brief period of relative peace,
Right.
but it didn't ultimately address those root causes
Right.
of the conflict.
Which makes me wonder, I mean, what's the takeaway here for us?
Well, I think one of the things that this treaty really highlights is the complexity.
Yeah.
of, trying to build relationships between different groups of people, especially when you have such a power imbalance.
Yeah.
You have these colonists who are coming in with their own ideas about land ownership and religion and culture.
Right.
And then you have the Wabanaki, who have been living in this land for centuries
Right.
with their own very different set of beliefs and practices.
Yes. And so trying to find a way to bridge that gap
Yeah.
was and continues to be a huge challenge.
Absolutely. And I think even though this particular peace didn't last,
Yeah.
the treaty itself is still a really valuable historical document
I completely agree.
because it shows us those complexities. And I think it reminds us that, even when we do reach agreements,
Yeah.
those underlying issues
Right.
can sometimes persist.
Absolutely. And I think it also speaks to the resilience of the Wabanaki people
Yeah.
who, despite facing these incredible challenges, they fought to preserve their way of life.
Right.
They negotiated for their rights. They adapted to changing circumstances.
Yeah.
And, they continue to be a vibrant presence in this region today.
That's a good point.
So I think their story is one of strength and perseverance.
Yeah.
And it's a story that I think we can all learn from.
Absolutely. Well, on that note,
Yeah.
we'll wrap up our deep dive into the Treaty of Casco.
Sounds good.
A short-lived peace,
Mm-hmm.
but such a powerful reminder of, all those complexities
Yeah.
of history.
Yeah.
And how important understanding and respect are,
I agree.
especially in a world that's constantly changing.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks.
See you next time for another deep dive.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.